Welcome to the session number 2 of learning PivotViewer extension for reporting services. I'd like to show you the anatomy of a PivotViewer application. In particular, what do you need to build for PivotViewer extension for RS in order to be successful? Basically, some tips and tricks. We'll start by looking at the sample application provided that we've learned how to install in the previous video session. The central part of the application is the card, which is a report rendered as a picture. And I'd like to point out that such a report has some particularities. Firstly, even when looking from far away, the pictures provide information. I mean by far away, a point where many cards are on the screen, but you can't really distinguish details about an individual picture. Still, even here, you can get the dominant color of the card to provide you information about the proportion of the categories. Good, which is green, to bad. Now, let's look how we've done that. We are opening now the Power Pivot workbook, which is the source of the report. We'll open the Power Pivot window, and we see that I have categorized the account managers into 3 categories by color: red, green, and yellow. Basically, it's a DAX expression that says that if your gap ratio is smaller than 0, you exceeded your plan and you are green. Otherwise, if you are within 10% of your goal, you are yellow. And if you are above 10% of discrepancy from the goal, you are red. So that's pretty bad. So now everybody is in one of these 3 categories. Then I have designed a report with Report Builder that uses this information to draw a relatively thick border in the respective color. Relatively thick needs to be understood as thick enough to provide visual context when look at it from far away. And this is how it looks, the border. Now the expression for creating such a border is trivial. It's a switch that simply says that if the color of the account manager coming from the Power Pivot window is red, we get FF0000, which is the color red, and so on. The second aspect that I need to provision the report with, it's a parameter that will allow the application generator to feed in all the account manager's identifiers and render one card for each of them. And I have done that by having a parameter inside the report, and take this parameter into consideration when considering the pictures that I have to show. I'm using the value of the parameters and so on. Now, let's look at the card building process. In SharePoint, I have this BI collection administration list where PivotViewer applications are defined. For the account manager applications, I'm going to look at its definition. And the first thing I see here is the link to the reporting services report. Now, I also need to specify that I would like to render the report as an image, and the output format is PNG. This is my recommendation, that you would use PNG format because it's a non-lossy format. And also, the second recommendation is that you would have the largest dimension of the picture be 1024 pixels. Because the report would be scaled up or down to 1024 pixels anyway of the largest dimension by preserving the aspects. And if the software sees that the largest dimension is 1024 pixels already, the transformation is trivial and takes less time. The appropriate link would need to also include a place for the parameter And the special thing is the zero between curly braces, which the application generator for PivotViewer extension will replace with each and every card identifier. The second thing I need to look at is how do we specify the card identifiers. We specify a connection is in the report parameter data source. In this case is the same workbook that the report is based upon. A type of the connection, which could be SQL or ADOMD.NET, in this case is ADOMD.NET, and a query. I have already the query inside SQL Server Management Studio. We execute it, and we see that we receive one identifier for each account manager. Is the same one that the report builder used as parameter identifier. In my case, I use the unique name, but there is a discussion in the documentation about what are your possible options. I suggest you carefully read the corresponding chapter from the documentation, as more query types can be specified. For example, MDX queries with 2 access, or SQL queries for SQL data sources, which actually could be very powerful. The last part I want to look at is the query in which we associate data with the report, such that we can slice and dice in PivotViewer. Data associated with the report is presented here on the left side, and also when we focus on a card on the right hand side, and it allows us to drill across to, for example, people that share the same manager. Let's take a look at the query in SQL Server Management Studio. I have here the query for the sample application. We'll execute it. And we see for each card, we get a multitude of information. We get the same card identifier that we used before. This is mandatory to be in the first position. The second facet is the data about the name of the card. The name of the card is the one that appears here in the right hand side corner, where it says 07941 Donald Gonzalez. And after the third and next positions appear what we call the facets. Like the region, the district, the gender, and so on. Any facet has a data type. And depending on the data type, you can get different slicing experiences for the data. For example, numbers have a continuous slicing, while strings have a discrete slicing. I suggest you carefully read the corresponding chapter from the documentation, as again, multiple types of queries can be specified, as well as SQL queries for SQL data sources. So what we got today, we went over how we built this sample application, keeping in mind that we want to give a good experience, very visual, that makes a personal connection with the account manager and is very appealing on how to browse the data. Thank you.